The train's whistle pierced the morning air of Cedar Falls, Montana, as it pulled into the modest station with a grinding screech of metal on metal. Grace Mitchell clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, her knuckles white against the dark handle as she peered through the dusty window at the platform below. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a rhythm of hope and terror that had kept her awake for the past 3 nights of travel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. After 18 months of correspondence with James Hartford, she was finally here. Finally about to meet the man who had written such tender letters about building a life together on his cattle ranch, about needing a woman of strong character and gentle spirit to share the vastness of Montana territory. Not once in all their exchanges had he asked about her physical appearance beyond requesting a photograph, which she had carefully composed to show only her face and shoulders, her best blue dress pristine, and her auburn hair arranged in soft waves around her features. Grace's right hand moved instinctively to smooth her traveling skirt, ensuring it fell properly to conceal the truth she had carried since childhood. Her left leg, withered and weak from a bout of polio at age 4, had never grown as it should have. The limp was pronounced, requiring her to lean heavily on a walking stick for any distance beyond a few steps. It was the reason she had remained. Unmarried at 28, the reason her father's death 3 years ago had left her dependent on the grudging charity of her brother's wife in Baltimore. The reason she had finally answered James Hartford's advertisement in the matrimonial column. The conductor's voice boomed through the car. "Cedar Falls, Montana, end of the line." Grace waited until the other passengers had disembarked before slowly making her way to the exit, her walking stick tapping against the wooden floor with each careful step. The conductor, a kindly man with grey whiskers who had helped her board in Baltimore, offered his arm as she navigated the steep steps down to the platform. "There you are, miss," he said gently, steadying her as her feet found solid ground. "Safe and sound in Montana." "Thank you," Grace murmured, scanning the small crowd gathered at the station. Her eyes searched for the tall, broad-shouldered man, with dark hair that James had described in his letters. There, standing near the station house, was a figure that matched his description perfectly. Well-dressed in a brown suit and string tie, with a confident posture that spoke of prosperity and success. Grace took a deep breath, gripped her walking stick firmly, and began making her way across the platform. Each step was careful and deliberate, her right leg bearing most of her weight while her left leg dragged slightly behind. The morning sun caught the copper highlights in her hair, and she held her chin high despite the curious stares from other travelers and townspeople. James Hartford looked up as she approached, his eyes widening as they took in her face, then, traveling downward to register her walking stick and uneven gait, the smile that had begun to form on his lips froze, then slowly transformed into something that made Grace's stomach clench with dread. "Mr. Hartford," she said, her voice steady, despite the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. "I'm Grace Mitchell." James Hartford's brown eyes, which had seemed warm and welcoming in the photograph he had sent, now held an expression of undisguised shock and what could only be described as revulsion. He took an involuntary step backward, his gaze fixed on a walking stick as if it were a snake coiled to strike. He began, then stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "Your letters never mentioned that you were—" He gestured vaguely toward her leg, unable to voice the word crippled that hung in the air between them. Grace's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice level. "I wrote about my character, my values, my desire to be a good wife and partner. I believed those were the qualities that mattered to you. Those letters spoke of a helpmate," James said, his voice growing harder with each word. "Someone who could work alongside me, tend to cattle, manage a household in rough country. How? Can you expect to fulfill those duties when you can barely walk across a train platform? The words hit Grace like physical blows. She had known this moment might come, had rehearsed various responses during the long journey west, but nothing had prepared her for the cold contempt in his voice or the way he looked at her, as if she had deliberately deceived him. "I may walk differently, Mr. Hartford, but my hands are strong, my mind is sharp, and my will is determined," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I have managed my father's household for 10 years, including during his long illness. I can cook, sew, tend gardens, and keep accounts. What I cannot do is run or climb or dance, but I never claimed to be able to do those things." James Hartford shook his head, his jaw set in a hard line. "This isn't what I agreed to. I need a wife who can keep up with ranch life, not someone who would be a burden." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, counting out several bills. "Here's money for your return ticket to Baltimore. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but this arrangement cannot proceed." Grace stared at the money he held out to her, the final confirmation that she had traveled 2,000 miles only to be discarded like a damaged piece of merchandise. The tears she had fought to contain during their conversation threatened to spill over, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Keep your money, Mr. Hartford," she said quietly, turning away from his outstretched hand. "I wouldn't want to burden you further." She began walking toward the bench at the far end of the platform, each step an effort of will as much as physical movement. Behind her, she heard James Hartford speak to someone, probably arranging for her trunk to be left on the platform, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see his face again, or to watch him walk away as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of. The wooden bench was rough and weathered, but it offered refuge from the need to keep standing. Grace sank onto it gratefully, setting her walking stick across her knees and finally allowing herself to assess her situation. She had exactly $12 in her reticule, hardly enough for food and lodging while waiting for the next eastbound train, let alone passage back to Baltimore. Her trunk sat abandoned near the station house, containing all her worldly possessions and the trousseau she had carefully assembled with dreams of married life. Cedar Falls stretched before her in the morning light, a typical frontier town with false-fronted buildings lining a wide main street. She could see a general store, what appeared to be a hotel or boarding house, a saloon already showing signs of early activity, and various other establishments that served the surrounding ranching and mining community. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks capped with snow even in late September, and the air carried the crisp promise of the coming winter. Everything was beautiful and foreign and completely overwhelming to a woman who had spent her entire life in the civilized confines of Baltimore society. Here she was not just an unmarried woman with a disability, she was a stranger with no connections, no prospects, and rapidly dwindling resources. "Miss, are you waiting for someone?" Grace looked up to find a middle-aged man in railroad overalls, studying her with concern. His weathered face was kind, and his tone held genuine worry rather than curiosity. "I was," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "But it seems they were delayed." The man nodded, though his eyes flicked to her abandoned trunk and back to her face with an expression that suggested he had witnessed similar scenes before. "Station agent's name is Bob Henley. He keeps track of who's expected on which trains. Might be able to help you sort things out." "Thank you," Grace said. "That's very kind." The man touched his cap and moved on, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts once more. She watched the last of the arriving passengers collect their belongings and disperse into the town, watched the locomotive take on water and coal for its return journey east. In 3 days, it would depart for Baltimore, carrying passengers back to the world she had left behind. But what world was that, really? Her brother Thomas had made it clear that his wife Rebecca found Grace's presence in their household an unwelcome, a burden, There had been whispered conversations about arrangements and suitable institutions that had driven Grace to answer James Hartford's advertisement in the first place. She had no employment prospects in Baltimore. What respectable family would hire a governess or companion who required a walking stick? Her small inheritance from her father had been exhausted during his final illness. A commotion near the station house drew her attention. Two men were loading her trunk onto a wagon, directed by James Hartford, who stood with his back to her. Even from a distance, she could see the set of his shoulders, the way he gestured impatiently. He was washing his hands of her as efficiently as possible, probably to avoid any further embarrassment or inconvenience. The wagon pulled away, heading toward what appeared to be a boarding house at the far end of the main street. At least he had arranged for her belongings to be stored somewhere, though whether out of guilt or mere practicality, she couldn't say. As the morning wore on, Cedar Falls came alive around her. Shopkeepers opened their doors, children ran laughing down the boardwalks, and the sounds of a busy frontier town filled the air. Grace watched it all from her bench, feeling invisible and utterly alone. Several people glanced her way, but none approached after noting her walking stick and her obvious distress. The sun climbed higher, bringing warmth that was welcome after the cool morning air. Grace's stomach began to remind her that she had been too nervous to eat breakfast on the train, but the thought of navigating unfamiliar streets and potentially hostile stares kept her rooted to her bench. She had faced curious looks and whispered comments all her life, but never in a place where she was completely friendless and dependent on the kindness of strangers. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was deep and carefully polite. Grace looked up to see a man standing a respectful distance away, hat in his hands. He was tall and powerfully built, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who worked with his body for a living. His clothes were clean but practical. Dark trousers, a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill, and a leather apron that suggested he was a craftsman of some kind. What caught and held her attention, however, was his face. The left side was ruggedly handsome, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes, but the right side bore the twisted remnants of severe burn scars, the skin puckered and discolored from temple to jaw, pulling his mouth into a permanent, slight grimace. "I'm Daniel Cooper," he said, his voice gentle despite his intimidating size. "I couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here for some time. Are you feeling unwell?" Grace studied his face, noting that his eyes held no pity, no revulsion. At her walking stick, just genuine concern for a stranger who appeared to be in distress. After James Hartford's reaction, such simple kindness felt like water in the desert. "I'm quite well, thank you," she replied. Then honesty compelled her to add, "though I find myself in somewhat uncertain circumstances." Daniel Cooper nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "New to Cedar Falls?" "Very new. I arrived on this morning's train. From back east, by your accent. Long journey to find yourself stranded at the station." It wasn't a question, and Grace appreciated that he didn't press for details she wasn't ready to share. "Yes, it has been a very long journey indeed." Daniel shifted his weight, and Grace noticed that he moved carefully, as if favoring his right side, where the scars disappeared beneath his shirt. Whatever had burned his face had clearly damaged more than just the surface. "I run the Blacksmith shop here in town," he said. "It's honest work, and it's given me a good sense of folks' character. You strike me as someone who's got more backbone than your current situation might suggest." The observation was so unexpected and so accurate that Grace felt tears prick her eyes again. "I'd like to think so." "Hotel serves a decent midday meal," Daniel continued conversationally. "Nothing fancy, but filling and reasonably priced. Might help you think more clearly about your next steps." Grace hesitated. The kindness of this scarred stranger was almost overwhelming after the morning's rejection, but she was also acutely aware of her limited resources. That's very thoughtful. But I should be careful with my expenses. Daniel's expression grew more serious. Miss, I don't know what brought you to Cedar Falls or what's keeping you on that bench, but I do know that an empty stomach never helped anyone make wise decisions. Consider it a welcome to Montana. Before Grace could protest, he had moved to her side and offered his arm with the same careful politeness she might have expected from a gentleman in Baltimore's finest drawing rooms. My shop's just down the street. We can stop there first so I can bank my forge, then head to the hotel. Grace looked up into his scarred face, seeing patience and understanding that seemed to come from his own experience with being judged by appearances. Slowly, she reached for her walking stick and accepted his offered arm, allowing him to help her to her feet. I'm Grace Mitchell, she said, as they began walking slowly toward the main street. Pleased to meet you, Miss Mitchell. Welcome to Cedar Falls. As they made their way down the boardwalk, Grace noticed that Daniel adjusted his pace to match hers without making a show of it, and that he positioned himself between her and the curious glances of passers-by. His presence was solid and reassuring, and for the first time since stepping off the train, she felt as if she might not be entirely alone in this strange new place. The blacksmith shop sat at the corner of Main Street and what appeared to be the town's primary residential area. It was a substantial building with wide doors that stood open to reveal a forge glowing red-hot in the interior. The familiar sound of metal on metal rang out as they approached, and Grace could see another man working at an anvil inside, preparing. And narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's my partner, Ben Cartwright, Daniel explained. He keeps things running when I have to step away. They paused at the entrance, while Daniel spoke briefly to his partner, explaining that he would be gone for an hour or so. Ben Cartwright was a wiry man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and arms like iron cables. He glanced at Grace with mild curiosity but no judgment, nodding politely when Daniel introduced them. "Pleasure, miss," Ben said, touching his cap. "Hope you find Cedar Falls to your liking." "Thank you," Grace replied, warmed by the simple courtesy. As they continued toward the hotel, Daniel pointed out various landmarks and businesses. "That's Morrison's General Store, best prices in town, and Sarah Morrison's fare in her dealings. The bank there is solid, run by Edgar Whitman, who's honest as the day is long. Doc Peterson's office is above the barber shop, and he's delivered half the babies in this county." Grace absorbed this information, beginning to get a sense of Cedar Falls as a real community rather than just a collection of buildings. The town was larger than she had initially thought, with side streets that led to residential areas where smoke curled from chimneys and children played in fenced yards. "It seems like a pleasant place," she said, meaning it. "It is," Daniel agreed. "Frontier life isn't easy, but folks here look out for each other. We have to, being so far from the civilized world." The hotel was a two-story building with a wide front porch and windows that sparkled in the midday sun. A painted sign identified it as the Mountain View Hotel, and Grace could indeed see the snow-capped peaks rising beyond the town's outskirts through the dining room windows. Daniel held the door for her, and they entered a lobby that was simple but clean, with polished wooden floors and sturdy furniture. The dining room adjoined the lobby, separated by an archway draped with curtains that were currently tied back. Most of the tables were occupied by what appeared to be local businessmen and travelers, all engaged in quiet conversation over there. "Meals, Mr. Cooper." A woman in her 40s with graying brown hair and a warm smile approached them. "How nice to see you, and you've brought a guest." "Mrs. Patterson, this is Miss Grace Mitchell. She arrived on this morning's train and could use a good meal and some friendly conversation." Mrs. Patterson's eyes took in Grace's walking stick and travel-worn appearance with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to caring for people, but her smile never wavered. "Of course, dear. Right this way. I have a lovely table by the window where you can see the mountains." She led them to a corner table with a view of the peaks Daniel had mentioned, pulling out Grace's chair with the same solicitous care she might have shown to any lady of quality. The gesture was so normal, so free of the awkward pity Grace was accustomed to, that she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Today's special is beef stew with fresh biscuits," Mrs. Patterson announced. "And I just pulled an apple pie from the oven that's worthy of bragging about." "That sounds perfect," Daniel said, looking to Grace for confirmation. "Wonderful," Grace agreed, surprised to find that her appetite was returning. As Mrs. Patterson bustled away to fetch their meals, Grace found herself studying Daniel's profile. As he gazed out at the mountains, the scarred side of his face was toward her, allowing her to see the full extent of the damage that had been done to him. Whatever accident had caused those burns had been severe, yet he carried himself with quiet dignity and seemed to have found his place in this community. "How long have you lived in Cedar Falls?" she asked. 5 years come Christmas," Daniel replied, turning back to face her. "Came west after my accident, looking for a place where I could start over." "What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes distant with memory. "Mill fire back in Ohio. I was the foreman, responsible for getting the men out safely. Managed that, but a burning beam came down as I was making sure everyone was clear. Spent 3 months in the hospital, another 6 months learning to use my right arm properly again." Grace absorbed this information, understanding now the careful way he moved, the slight hesitation in his gestures. That must have been terrifying. It was, but not as much as what came after. Daniel's voice grew quiet. "Folks back home looked at me differently once the bandages came off. Some with pity, some with revulsion, most with that careful politeness. That's worse than either. Made it clear I'd never be the man I was before, never be suitable for the life I'd planned." The pain in his voice resonated deep in Grace's chest. She knew exactly that particular brand of careful politeness. The way people's expressions changed when they noticed her walking stick, the assumptions they made about her capabilities and worth. "So you came to Montana?" "Came to Montana," Daniel confirmed. "Found that frontier folk care more about what you can do than what you look like. Ben Cartwright needed a partner who understood metalwork and wasn't afraid of hard labor. Turned out I could still swing a hammer and shape iron, scars and all." Mrs. Patterson returned with steaming bowls of stew and a basket of biscuits that smelled like heaven. The stew was rich and hearty, full of tender beef and vegetables, and the biscuits were light and buttery. Grace realized she was genuinely hungry for the first time in days. "This is delicious," she said after several spoonfuls. "Wait until you try the pie," Daniel said with the first genuine smile she had seen from him. The expression transformed his face, making the scars seem less significant and highlighting the warmth in his dark eyes. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the activity on the street outside. Grace observed the rhythm of the town, the way people nodded to each other as they passed, the children playing with hoops and sticks, the general air of purposeful activity. "What brings you to Cedar Falls, Miss Mitchell?" Daniel asked eventually, his tone careful and respectful. Grace set down her spoon, considering how much to reveal to this kind stranger. Something about his own story of starting over made her want to be honest. "I came to marry a man I had been corresponding with for over a year," she said finally. "James Hartford. He owns a cattle ranch outside of town." Daniel's expression grew more serious. "I know James Hartford." The way he said it made Grace look up sharply. "You don't approve of him. Let's just say his character isn't as sterling as his bank account might suggest." Daniel hesitated, then asked, "I take it the meeting didn't go as planned?" Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Hartford found my physical condition unsuitable for ranch life. He was quite clear that he needed a wife who could keep up, as he put it. Daniel's jaw tightened, and Grace saw anger flash in his dark eyes. James Hartford is a fool and a coward. Any man who would judge a woman's worth by her ability to run or climb doesn't deserve the privilege of her company. The fierce defense from this man she had met only an hour ago brought tears to Grace's eyes. "You're very kind to say so." "I'm not being kind. I'm being truthful." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice intense. "I've seen you walk the length of this town without complaint, carry yourself with dignity in the face of disappointment, and show courtesy to strangers who have no claim on your attention. Those are the qualities that matter in a partner, not whether you can chase cattle across a pasture." Grace stared at him, overwhelmed by the certainty in his voice. After a lifetime of being told she was limited by her disability. After this morning's crushing rejection, Daniel Cooper's words felt like balm on wounds she had carried for years. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. Grace sighed, the practical realities of her situation rushing back. "I suppose I'll return to Baltimore on the next eastbound train. I don't have many options." "What's waiting for you there?" The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of Grace's dilemma. "Not much," she admitted. "My brother's household, where I'm barely tolerated. No prospects for employment or independence." Daniel was quiet for a moment, apparently considering something. Finally he said, "What if I told you there might be opportunities here in Cedar Falls for someone with your education and character?" Grace felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "What sort of opportunities?" "Well, the town's been trying to establish a proper school for months. We've got nearly 40 children and no qualified teacher. The pay wouldn't be much, but it would be honest work, and there's a teacherage that comes with the position. A school." Grace felt her heart quicken. She had always loved learning, had taught Sunday school classes back in Baltimore, and helped tutor neighborhood children in reading and mathematics. The idea of having her own classroom, her own students, was more appealing than she had dared to imagine. "Do you think they would consider someone like me?" she asked, trying not to let too much hope creep into her voice. "I think they'd be lucky to have someone with your obvious intelligence and education," Daniel replied firmly. "Question is, would you be willing to consider staying in Cedar Falls long enough to find out?" Grace looked out at the mountains beyond the town, at the wide sky, and the sense of possibility that seemed to hang in the clear mountain air. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt as if the future might hold something other than disappointment and dependence. Daniel was quiet for a moment, apparently considering something. Finally he said, "What if I told you there might be opportunities here in Cedar Falls for someone with your education and character?" Grace felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "What sort of opportunities?" "Well, the town's been trying to establish a proper school for months. We've got nearly 40 children and no qualified teacher. The pay wouldn't be much, but it would be honest work, and there's a teacherage that comes with the position. A school." Grace felt her heart quicken. She had always loved learning, had taught Sunday school classes back in Baltimore, and helped tutor neighborhood children in reading and mathematics. The idea of having her own classroom, her own students, was more appealing than she had dared to imagine. "Do you think they would consider someone like me?" she asked, trying not to let too much hope creep into her voice. "I think they'd be lucky to have someone with your obvious intelligence and education," Daniel replied firmly. "Question is, would you be willing to consider staying in Cedar Falls long enough to find out?" Grace looked out at the mountains beyond the town, at the wide sky, and the sense of possibility that seemed to hang in the clear mountain air. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt as if the future might hold something other than disappointment and dependence. "I think I might be," she said quietly, and saw Daniel Cooper's scarred face transform with the warmest smile she had ever received. The next morning brought crystalline mountain air and the kind of golden sunlight that made Cedar Falls look like something from a picture book. Grace woke in the small but comfortable room at the Mountain View Hotel, where Mrs. Patterson had insisted she stay the night at a reduced rate after learning of her circumstances. Through her window, she could see the town coming alive with the purposeful activity of people who had work to do and places to be. Her walking stick rested against the bedside table, polished wood worn smooth by years of use. Grace had learned long ago to check her leg each morning, to stretch and massage the weakened muscles before attempting to walk. The ritual was private and necessary, a reminder of her limitations that she had never shared with anyone. A soft knock interrupted her morning routine. "Miss Mitchell?" came Mrs. Patterson's voice through the door. "I've brought you some breakfast and hot water for washing." "Coming?" Grace called, wrapping her robe around herself and making her way carefully to unlock the door. Mrs. Patterson entered with a tray bearing fresh biscuits, eggs, and strong coffee, along with a pitcher of steaming water. Her eyes swept over Grace's nightclothes and the walking stick with the matter-of-fact acceptance that seemed characteristic of frontier women. "Sleep well, dear?" "Better than I have in weeks," Grace admitted, accepting the breakfast tray gratefully. "You've been so kind." "Nonsense. We look after our own here." Mrs. Patterson began arranging fresh towels by the washstand. "Daniel Cooper stopped by earlier. Asked me to tell you he'll be around 10 o'clock to introduce you to some folks who might be interested in meeting you." Grace's pulse quickened. "The school board?" "Among others. Word travels fast in a town this size, and there's already considerable interest in the idea of having a proper teacher." Mrs. Patterson paused in her bustling. "I should warn you, though, not everyone's as forward-thinking as Daniel. Some of the old-timers have particular ideas about what a teacher should look like." The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in Grace's stomach. "I see. Don't you worry too much," Mrs. Patterson said briskly. "Daniel Cooper's word carries weight in this community. If he vouches for you, that matters to the people who count." She moved toward the door, then turned back. "There's one more thing. Elizabeth Hartwell. She's the doctor's wife and heads up most of the women's charitable activities. She's asked if she might call on you this morning. Nothing formal, just wants to meet you." After Mrs. Patterson left, Grace dressed carefully. In her best day dress, a deep blue wool with simple lines that flattered her figure without calling attention to her disability. She arranged her auburn hair in a practical but becoming style and pinned a small cameo brooch at her throat, a gift from her father that she wore for luck and courage. The breakfast was excellent, and the strong coffee helped clear the lingering fatigue from her journey. As she ate, Grace watched the street below, noting the easy interactions between townspeople, the way children ran freely between shops, the general air of prosperity and contentment that pervaded Cedar Falls. At precisely 9:30, there was another knock at her door. Grace opened it to find a woman of perhaps 40 years, with intelligent grey eyes and prematurely silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She wore a well-tailored dress of forest green and carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and responsibility. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Elizabeth Hartwell. I hope you don't mind my calling so early." "Of course not. Please come in." Grace stepped back to admit her visitor, immediately impressed by the woman's direct manner and warm smile. Elizabeth accepted the offered chair by the window, declining refreshment, but accepting Grace's invitation to sit and talk. "I understand. You're considering remaining in Cedar Falls." "I'm exploring the possibility, yes. Mr. Cooper mentioned there might be opportunities for someone with my background. Indeed, there might be." Elizabeth studied Grace with the same careful assessment. Grace had noticed in Mrs. Patterson, but there was something more penetrating in this examination. "Tell me about your educational experience." Grace found herself relaxing as she described her schooling at the Pemberton Female Seminary in Baltimore, her years of private tutoring, and her experience teaching Sunday school and literacy classes. Over immigrant women, Elizabeth asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated both her own education and her genuine interest in Grace's qualifications. "You speak French and German?" "Reasonably well. My father believed languages opened doors to understanding different cultures. And mathematics through algebra?" "Yes, and basic geometry. I find mathematical concepts quite fascinating, actually." Elizabeth's eyes lit with interest. "How refreshing. Most young ladies of my acquaintance consider mathematics a necessary evil. At best." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "I should be direct with you, Miss Mitchell. Cedar Falls has a need of a teacher, but there are those who will question whether you're physically capable of managing a classroom of frontier children." Grace had expected this concern. "I understand their hesitation. I can only say that I've managed groups of children before, and that my experience has been that respect and engagement are more effective than physical dominance in maintaining discipline." Spoken like a true educator. Elizabeth rose and moved to the window, gazing down at the street below. "There's something else you should know. James Hartford has been spreading his version of yesterday's events, painting you as a deceiver who misrepresented herself to trap him into marriage." Heat flashed through Grace at this characterization, but she kept her voice level. "And what does the community think of his version?" Elizabeth turned back to face her, a slight smile playing at her lips. "That says more about James Hartford's character than yours. The man has a reputation for finding fault with anything that doesn't serve his immediate purposes." She returned to her chair. "However, there are those who might be influenced by his account, particularly if they're already skeptical about hiring a woman with a disability. I appreciate your honesty." "Good, because I believe in addressing challenges directly rather than pretending they don't exist." Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. "I also believe in recognizing quality when I see it. Your education is superior to anything we've had available locally, and your manner suggests both intelligence and strength of character. If you're truly interested in remaining in Cedar Falls, I'm prepared to support your candidacy for the teaching position." Grace felt a surge of hope so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you can know. Don't thank me yet. There's still the matter of convincing the school board, and they can be a stubborn lot." Elizabeth's expression grew thoughtful. "There is one advantage you have that you may not realize." "What's that?" "Daniel Cooper's endorsement. He doesn't give his approval lightly, and he's earned tremendous respect in this community through his work and his character. If he believes in you, others will listen." As if summoned by their conversation, a familiar knock sounded at the door. Grace opened it to find Daniel standing in the hallway, hat in hand, wearing clean work clothes and an expression of determined purpose. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, nodding respectfully to Elizabeth. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. Miss Mitchell and I were just discussing the teaching opportunity." Elizabeth gathered her gloves and reticule. "I'll leave you to make your rounds, Daniel. Miss Mitchell, it was a pleasure meeting you. I look forward to seeing you at this afternoon's gathering." After Elizabeth left, Daniel turned to Grace with a slightly apologetic expression. "I hope you don't mind, but I've arranged for you to meet several members of the school board and some other prominent citizens. Nothing formal, just introductions over coffee at Morrison's General Store." Grace felt her stomach flutter with nerves. "Are you certain they want to meet me after what Mr. Hartford has been saying?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "James Hartford's opinion carries less weight than he believes. The people worth knowing in this town judge folks by their actions, not their gossip." He offered her his arm. "Ready to show them what you're made of?" Morrison's General Store occupied a prominent position on Main Street, with large windows that displayed everything from farming implements to bolts of colorful fabric. The interior was spacious and well organized, with a small area near the back that had been set up with chairs arranged in a circle around a table laden with coffee and fresh pastries. Several people were already present when Grace and Daniel arrived. A tall, thin man with spectacles and the ink-stained fingers of someone who worked with accounts and correspondence rose to greet them. This was Robert Morrison, the store's owner and the de facto head of the school board. "Miss Mitchell," he said, extending his hand with formal courtesy. "Welcome to Cedar Falls. I understand you might be interested in our teaching position." "I am indeed, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Morrison introduced the others present. Margaret Sullivan, a rancher's widow who served as the school board secretary. Tom Bradley, a prosperous farmer whose children would be among Grace's potential students. And Sarah Morrison, Robert's wife, who had been acting as the temporary teacher since the previous instructor had left to marry. "Please, sit down," Sarah Morrison said, guiding Grace to a comfortable chair. "We're eager to hear about your background and experience." For the next hour, Grace found herself answering questions about her education, her teaching philosophy, and her approach to managing children of various ages in a single classroom. The board members were thorough, but not hostile, clearly taking their responsibilities seriously while maintaining a respectful tone. "How would you handle discipline issues?" Tom Bradley asked. "Some of these children come from rough backgrounds, and they're not always inclined to respect authority. I believe consistent expectations and engaging instruction prevent most discipline." "Problems," Grace replied. "When issues do arise, I prefer to address them through natural consequences and by helping children understand the impact of their behavior on others." "And if a child simply refuses to cooperate?" Margaret Sullivan pressed. Grace smiled slightly. "In my experience, Mrs. Sullivan, children who refuse to cooperate are usually children who are bored, frustrated, or dealing with problems outside the classroom. I would work to understand the underlying cause rather than simply demanding compliance." Robert Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Grace thoughtfully. "Your approach sounds progressive. Some parents might find it too lenient." "Perhaps initially," Grace acknowledged, "but I believe parents want their children to learn and grow, not simply to be controlled. When they see their children excited about learning and making real progress, they tend to support whatever methods produce those results." Daniel, who had remained largely silent during the questioning, finally spoke up. "Miss Mitchell, perhaps you could tell them about your work with the immigrant families in Baltimore." Grace described her volunteer work, teaching English and basic literacy to women who had recently arrived from Ireland and Germany, explaining how she had adapted her methods to accommodate students with no formal education while respecting their dignity and cultural backgrounds. "That shows real adaptability," Sarah Morrison observed approvingly. "Teaching frontier children requires similar flexibility." The conversation continued with questions about curriculum, resources, and Grace's willingness to participate in community events and activities beyond the classroom. Throughout the discussion, Grace was aware of the careful way the board members observed her movements, noted her walking stick, and occasionally exchanged glances that she couldn't quite interpret. Finally, Robert Morrison cleared his throat. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you won't take offense at a direct question, but we need to address the practical concerns. Teaching here involves more than classroom instruction. There are school programs, community events, sometimes even medical emergencies when Doc Peterson isn't immediately available. Are you confident you can handle all aspects of the position?" Grace had been preparing for this question since her conversation with Elizabeth Hartwell. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your concerns, and I appreciate your directness. I won't pretend that my disability doesn't present certain challenges. I can't run after a child who wanders off, and I might need help moving heavy furniture or supplies. However, I can organize programs, coordinate with parents, provide basic first aid, and maintain order in my classroom through preparation and engagement rather than physical intimidation." She paused, gathering her courage for what she wanted to say next. "More importantly, I can offer these children something they may never have had before. A teacher who understands what it means to be different, to face challenges that others don't understand, to find strength in spite of limitations rather than because of perfection." The silence that followed her words stretched long enough to make Grace wonder if she had said too much, revealed too much vulnerability. Then Margaret Sullivan spoke up, her voice warm with approval. "That's exactly the kind of wisdom our children need to hear." Tom Bradley nodded agreement. "Lord knows half these kids feel like outsiders for one reason or another. Might do them good to have a teacher who knows what that feels like." Robert Morrison looked around the circle, reading the expressions of his fellow board members. "Miss Mitchell, we'll need to discuss this among ourselves and get input from some of the parents, but I want you to know that your qualifications are impressive and your attitude is exactly what we've been hoping to find. When might you make a decision?" Grace asked, trying not to sound too eager. "The board meets again next Tuesday evening. We'll have an answer for you then." Morrison stood, extending his hand once more. "Thank you for your time today. Sarah will show you the schoolhouse tomorrow if you're interested in seeing where you might be working." As the gathering broke up, Grace found herself surrounded by friendly conversation. Sarah Morrison invited her to Sunday service at the community church. Margaret Sullivan asked about her family background, and Tom Bradley offered to have his wife call on her to discuss the social aspects of life in Cedar Falls. Daniel remained at her side throughout these interactions, not hovering protectively, but providing a steady, reassuring presence that seemed to put everyone at ease. Grace noticed how naturally people included him in conversations, how they sought his opinion on community matters, and how his scarred face was simply accepted as part of who he was. As they prepared to leave, Sarah Morrison approached Grace privately. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I think you'd be perfect for this position. These children need someone who sees their potential rather than their limitations." "Thank you," Grace replied sincerely. "That means a great deal coming from someone who's been working with them." Outside the general store, Daniel and Grace walked slowly back toward the hotel, the afternoon sun warm on their faces despite the mountain chill in the air. "That went well," Daniel observed. "I could see them warming to you as the conversation progressed." "Do you really think so?" "I felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying to be honest about my limitations without seeming incapable. You struck exactly the right balance. And your point about understanding what it means to be different, that resonated with them because it's true and because it matters." They paused at the hotel's front porch, and Grace turned to face Daniel fully. "Why are you doing this?" "Helping me, I mean. You barely know me." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes distant. "When I first came to Cedar Falls, I was bitter and angry and convinced that my scars meant I'd never have a real place anywhere. Ben Cartwright took a chance on me when no one else would, and this community accepted me for what I could contribute, rather than what I looked like." He met her gaze directly. "I suppose I recognize something of myself in your situation, and I know how much it means to have someone believe in your worth when you're not sure you believe in it yourself." The honesty in his words touched Grace deeply. "Well, I'm grateful for your faith in me, whether or not the school board shares it." "They will," Daniel said with quiet confidence. "Give them time to think it over, and they'll realize what I saw the moment I met you." "What's that?" Daniel's scarred face softened with a smile that transformed his entire expression. "That you're exactly what this town has been waiting for, whether we knew it or not." As Grace watched him walk back toward his forge, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that she was exactly where she belonged, that her differences might be not obstacles to overcome, but gifts to offer, and that perhaps her journey to Cedar Falls hadn't been a mistake after all, but the first step toward the life she was meant to live. Tuesday evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had drawn most of Cedar Falls outdoors to enjoy what might be the last pleasant evening before winter's grip tightened on the mountain valley. Grace sat in the hotel's small parlor, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the open windows while she waited for word from the school board meeting. The past 4 days had been a whirlwind of activity. Sarah Morrison had given her a thorough tour of the one-room schoolhouse, a sturdy log building that sat on a small rise overlooking the town. The interior was sparse but functional, with rough-hewn benches arranged in rows before a slate blackboard. That had seen better days. Shelves along one wall held a meager collection of well-worn textbooks and a few pieces of basic equipment, globes, maps, and arithmetic charts that would serve as the foundation of her teaching materials. "It's not much to look at," Sarah had apologized, "but it's sound and warm, and there's living quarters attached if you're interested." The teacherage, as Sarah called it, consisted of 2 small rooms behind the main classroom, a combination, sitting room and kitchen, and a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and washstand. It was modest to the point of being austere, but it represented something Grace had never had before: independence, privacy, and a space that would be entirely her own. More importantly, she had begun to meet the children who would be her students. Tom Bradley had brought his 3 youngsters to town, specifically to meet their potential teacher, and Grace had been charmed by their mixture of eagerness and wariness. 10-year-old Lucy Bradley had peppered her with questions about whether she knew any stories from back east, while her twin brothers had been more interested in whether she could solve the arithmetic problems that had been stumping them. "Miss, Sarah makes us copy the same sums over and over," 8-year-old Peter had complained, "but she never explains why we need to know them." Grace had spent an enjoyable hour showing the children how mathematics related to everyday activities, calculating the amount of seed needed for a vegetable garden, determining how many eggs would be required to bake bread for a week, figuring the cost of supplies for various household projects. By the end of their visit, all 3 Bradley children were looking forward to the possibility of having real lessons instead of simple repetition exercises. Word of these informal meetings had spread, and Grace found herself receiving visits from other families throughout the week. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with parents expressing relief at the prospect of having a qualified teacher for their children. Only 2 families had seemed hesitant, and both had connections to James Hartford's social circle. Daniel had been a constant presence during these encounters, not hovering or interfering, but available to provide context about family situations or community dynamics that helped Grace navigate the social complexities of her new environment. She had begun to understand that his position in Cedar Falls was more influential than his modest demeanor suggested. People sought his opinion on matters ranging from municipal improvements to business ventures, and his endorsement of her candidacy had clearly carried significant weight. Their relationship had evolved beyond simple kindness for a stranger in need. Grace found herself looking forward to their daily conversations, whether over coffee at the hotel dining room or during walks around the town's perimeter where they could speak more privately. Daniel's insights about frontier life were practical and valuable, but it was his understanding of what it meant to rebuild one's identity after devastating loss that created a deeper connection between them. "When I first came here," he had told her during one of their evening walks, "I was so focused on what I couldn't do anymore that I nearly missed discovering what I could do better than before. The fire changed me, but not all the changes were losses." "What do you mean?" Grace had asked. "Before the accident, I was ambitious, driven to succeed in conventional ways. I wanted to own the biggest mill, employ the most workers, make the most money. The scars taught me to value different things: honest work, genuine relationships, being useful to my community rather than just profitable. Grace had understood exactly what he meant. Her disability had forced her to develop patience, empathy, and inner strength that might never have emerged if life had been easier. The realization that Daniel saw these qualities as assets rather than compensations for physical limitations was both comforting and deeply attractive. Now, as she waited for the school board's decision, Grace reflected on how much her life had changed in just 1 week. She felt more like herself than she had in years, not the limited, dependent version of herself that had existed in Baltimore, but the capable, purposeful woman she had always believed she could be given the right circumstances. Footsteps on the hotel's front porch interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Daniel approaching, accompanied by Robert Morrison and Margaret Sullivan. Their expressions were unreadable in the lamplight, and Grace felt her heart begin to race. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the parlor door. "Miss Mitchell, you have visitors." Grace rose carefully, smoothing her skirts and ensuring her walking stick was properly positioned before making her way to the lobby. Daniel smiled as she appeared, but his companions maintained the serious expressions appropriate to their official capacity. "Miss Mitchell," Robert Morrison began formally, "the school board has reached a decision regarding the teaching position." Grace held her breath, acutely aware that this moment would determine whether she would remain in Cedar Falls or board the next eastbound train back to an uncertain future in Baltimore. "We would be honored to offer you the position of Cedar Falls school teacher," Morrison continued, his stern expression breaking into a genuine smile. "Provided, of course, that you're still interested in accepting it." Relief and joy flooded through Grace so powerfully that she had to grip her walking stick more tightly to maintain her composure. "I am very interested indeed, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for your confidence in me." Margaret Sullivan stepped forward, her lined face warm with approval. "The vote was unanimous, dear. Every parent we spoke with was impressed by your qualifications and your approach with their children." "When would you like me to begin?" Grace asked, hardly daring to believe that her professional future was suddenly secure. "Sarah Morrison has agreed to help with the transition for the remainder of this week," Morrison explained. "You could officially start Monday morning, if that suits you." "That would be perfect." They spent the next hour discussing practical details. Salary, which was modest but adequate for her needs, supplies and curriculum expectations, the schedule of community events where her presence would be expected, and arrangements for moving into the teacherage. Throughout the conversation, Daniel remained largely silent, but Grace was acutely aware of his presence and the quiet satisfaction that seemed to radiate from him. After Morrison and Sullivan departed, Daniel walked with Grace to the hotel's front porch where they could speak privately. "Congratulations," he said simply, but his voice carried a warmth that made Grace's pulse quicken. "I couldn't have done this without your help," she replied honestly. "Your introduction to the community, your endorsement, your willingness to take a chance on a stranger. None of this would have been possible without your kindness." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't create your qualifications or your character, Grace. I just helped people see what was already there." The use of her first name was still new enough to send a small thrill through her. Over the past week, their conversations had gradually become less formal, but hearing Daniel speak her name with such gentle familiarity felt like crossing an important threshold. "What happens now?" she asked. "I mean, beyond the obvious preparations for teaching." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. "Now you become part of Cedar Falls in earnest. The teaching position brings responsibilities beyond the classroom. You'll be expected to participate in social events, contribute to community discussions, and serve as a role model for propriety and education." Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. "That sounds rather intimidating." It doesn't have to be. The key is to be yourself, the same person who impressed the school board and won over the parents. Don't try to become someone you think they want you to be. And what about James Hartford? Will my presence in town create ongoing problems? Daniel's jaw tightened at the mention of Hartford's name. James will adjust to reality eventually. His opinion matters less than he believes, and most people have already formed their own judgments about what happened between you. As they talked, Grace noticed a group of riders approaching the hotel, their horses' hooves creating a rhythmic drumbeat on the packed earth of Main Street. Even in the lamplight, she could see that these were not ordinary travelers. Their clothing and equipment spoke of wealth and purpose. "Daniel," she said quietly, nodding toward the approaching riders. He turned to look, and his expression immediately grew guarded. "That's James Hartford and his foreman, along with a couple of men I don't recognize." The riders drew up in front of the hotel, and James Hartford dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was as handsome as Grace remembered, but there was something in his bearing that struck her. Differently now, an arrogance that she had missed during their correspondence, but that was unmistakable in person. "Miss Mitchell," Hartford said, touching his hat brim with cold politeness, "I understand congratulations are in order. The school board has seen fit to hire you despite the circumstances of your arrival." "Thank you, Mr. Hartford," Grace replied, evenly, though she could feel tension radiating from Daniel beside her. "I hope you understand that your position here will require you to maintain the highest standards of conduct," Hartford continued, his gaze flickering meaningfully between Grace and Daniel. "The community looks to its teacher as an example of moral rectitude." The implication was clear, and Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm quite aware of my responsibilities, Mr. Hartford." "I'm sure you are." Hartford's smile was cold and calculating. "Though I wonder if the school board fully understands what they've taken on. Teaching frontier children requires more than book learning. It demands physical capability and moral authority that some might find challenging to maintain." Daniel stepped forward slightly, his voice low but carrying clearly in the evening air. "The school board made their decision based on Miss Mitchell's qualifications and character, James. I'm sure they don't need your retrospective advice." Hartford's expression hardened as he focused on Daniel. "Of course, you would defend her, wouldn't you, Cooper? Birds of a feather, as they say." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Grace saw Daniel's hands clench at his sides. But before either man could respond, one of Hartford's companions, a well-dressed stranger with the bearing of a professional, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on the business that brought us to town, Mr. Hartford." Hartford glanced at his companion, then back at Grace and Daniel. "Indeed, Miss Mitchell, I hope your new position proves suitable to your capabilities. Cooper." He nodded curtly to Daniel, then remounted his horse and led his group away toward the hotel's stable. "Who was that with him?" Grace asked, watching. "The men disappear around the building. I don't know, but I intend to find out," Daniel replied grimly. "James Hartford doesn't usually travel with strangers unless he's conducting business, and his business lately has been focused on expanding his land holdings." The unpleasant encounter had cast a shadow over what should have been a purely celebratory evening. Grace found herself wondering what kind of opposition she might face as the new teacher, and whether her presence in Cedar Falls would create problems for Daniel as well. "I should get some rest," she said finally. "Tomorrow will be busy with preparations." Daniel nodded, but she could see that he was still troubled by Hartford's visit. "Grace, I want you to know that not everyone in Cedar Falls shares Hartford's attitudes. Most people judge others by their actions, not their appearance or their associations." "I know that, but he clearly has influence, and he's made his opinion of me quite plain. His influence isn't as extensive as he believes," Daniel said firmly. "And there are those of us who won't stand by quietly if he tries to cause trouble for you. The protective tone in his voice made Grace's heart skip, but it also worried her. "Daniel, I don't want you to make enemies on my account. You let me worry about James Hartford," Daniel replied. "You focus on being the teacher these children need." As Grace made her way upstairs to her room, she reflected on the complexity of her new situation. The teaching position was everything she had hoped for: meaningful work, financial independence, and acceptance by the community. But Hartford's obvious hostility suggested that her troubles with him were far from over. More concerning was the growing awareness that her feelings for Daniel were developing beyond gratitude and friendship. The way he had stepped forward to defend her, the protective anger in his voice when he spoke of Hartford, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, all of it pointed to emotions that could complicate her fresh start in Cedar Falls. She had come to Montana seeking security through marriage, only to be rejected for her physical limitations. Now she was finding something potentially more valuable: respect earned through her own abilities, a sense of purpose, and the possibility of a connection based on mutual understanding rather than mere convenience. But with James Hartford clearly opposed to her presence and her growing attachment to Daniel, Grace sensed that the challenges ahead would test not only her teaching abilities, but her courage and determination in ways she had not yet imagined. From her window, she could see lights burning late in the blacksmith shop, where Daniel was undoubtedly working off his frustration at the evening's encounter. The sight of that distant glow gave her comfort, a reminder that she was no longer facing the world's challenges entirely alone. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and new possibilities. For the first time in her adult life, Grace Mitchell was exactly where she chose to be, doing work that mattered, in a place where her contributions were valued. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, she would meet them with the same determination that had carried her across a continent in search of a better life. The dream of marriage and conventional happiness might have died with James Hartford's rejection, but something far more precious was taking its place: the hope of building a life on her own terms, with the support of people who saw her worth not despite her limitations, but because of the strength those limitations had helped her develop. 3 weeks into her tenure as Cedar Falls schoolteacher, Grace had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Each morning, she would rise before dawn in her small teacherage, prepare breakfast on the wood-burning stove, and spend the quiet hour before students arrived reviewing lesson plans and organizing materials. The schoolhouse had been transformed. Under her care, children's artwork adorned the walls, books were arranged in neat categories, and a large map of the United States dominated one corner where she conducted geography lessons that transported young minds far beyond the Montana territory. Her students had exceeded every expectation. 23 children, ranging from 6-year-old Emma Caldwell, who was just learning her letters, to 16-year-old Marcus Thompson, who possessed a mathematical mind that rivaled some college students she had known. The older children helped tutor the younger ones, creating a cooperative learning environment that freed Grace to provide individual attention where it was most needed. The morning routine had become precious to her. Children would arrive in small groups, some walking from nearby homes, others riding horses or arriving in farm wagons driven by older siblings. They would gather around her desk to share news from their families, ask questions about the previous day's assignments, or simply enjoy a few moments of individual attention from an adult who valued their thoughts and opinions. Miss Mitchell called Lucy Bradley as she hung her coat on one of the pegs near the door. "Pa says there's going to be a harvest celebration next weekend. Will you come?" "I wouldn't miss it," Grace replied, looking up from the arithmetic problems she was preparing. "For the older students, are you planning to enter any of the competitions?" "Mama's apple pie recipe," Lucy said proudly. "She's been teaching me to make the crust just right. These conversations, multiplied across 24 students, gave Grace insights into the rhythms of frontier life that no amount of observation could have provided. She learned about the challenges facing ranch families as winter approached, about the hopes and fears of parents who had come west seeking better opportunities for their children, and about the tight-knit community bonds that made survival possible. In such an isolated environment, her relationship with Daniel had deepened gradually, naturally, like water finding its course through stone. He had taken to stopping by the schoolhouse most afternoons, ostensibly to check on repairs or maintenance issues, but really to spend a few minutes talking with Grace about her day. Sometimes he would help her rearrange heavy furniture or carry supplies, but more often they would simply stand together in the schoolyard, watching the children play while sharing quiet conversation about everything and nothing. "You've worked magic with the Thompson boy," Daniel had observed the previous week, nodding toward Marcus, who was patiently explaining long division to 2 younger students. His father was worried he'd never amount to anything, being more interested in books than cattle. "Marcus has a brilliant mind," Grace had replied. "He just needed someone to recognize it and give him appropriate challenges. I've been corresponding with a mathematics professor in Denver about advanced texts we might obtain for him." Daniel's expression had grown thoughtful. "You're giving these children opportunities they never would have had otherwise. I'm giving them the same thing you gave me," Grace had said quietly, "someone who believes in their potential." It was during one of these conversations that they had first acknowledged the feelings growing between them, not with dramatic declarations or passionate embraces, but with a simple moment of shared understanding when Grace had stumbled slightly on the uneven ground and Daniel's hand had moved naturally to steady her. Their eyes had met and held, and in that instant both had recognized that their relationship had crossed an invisible line from friendship into something deeper and more complex. "Grace," Daniel had said softly, her name carrying a weight of meaning that made her heart race. "I know," she whispered back, understanding without need for explanation. They had not spoken of it directly since then, but the awareness hummed between them like electricity before a storm. Grace found herself thinking about Daniel at odd moments during the day, remembering the way he smiled when one of her students greeted him on the street, or how his scarred hands moved with such gentle precision when he helped her adjust the schoolhouse's temperamental stove. This particular Friday morning had begun like any other, but as Grace rang the bell to call her students to order, she noticed unusual activity in the town below. Several unfamiliar horses were tied outside the hotel, and a group of well-dressed men seemed to be conducting some kind of official business on the main street. "Miss Mitchell?" asked Sarah Whitman, the banker's 12-year-old daughter. "Why are there so many strangers in town?" "I'm not sure, Sarah. Perhaps they're here for business with one of the local ranches." Grace had learned to deflect questions about adult matters she didn't fully understand, redirecting her students' curiosity toward their lessons instead. The morning proceeded smoothly until just before the lunch break, when the schoolhouse door opened to admit James Hartford, accompanied by 2 men Grace didn't recognize. One was the well-dressed stranger she had seen with Hartford that evening at the hotel 3 weeks ago. The other was a thin, nervous-looking man with a leather portfolio under his arm. The children fell silent at the unexpected interruption. Hartford's presence alone would have been unusual. He had never shown any interest in the school or its activities, but the formal way he and his companions entered suggested this was not a social call. "Mr. Hartford," Grace said calmly, though her pulse quickened, "what brings you to our school today?" "Official business, Miss Mitchell," Hartford replied, his voice carrying an authority that seemed calculated to intimidate. "I believe you should be aware that there have been concerns raised about the suitability of your position here." Grace felt 23 pairs of young eyes watching this exchange with varying degrees of confusion and alarm. Several of the older Students, including Marcus Thompson and Lucy Bradley, looked distinctly protective, as if they sensed their teacher was under some kind of attack. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Grace suggested, nodding toward the children. "Actually, I think the community should witness this conversation," Hartford said smoothly. "Transparency in educational matters is essential." The well-dressed stranger stepped forward, removing a folded document from his coat pocket. "Miss Mitchell, I am Charles Pemberton, representing the Territorial Education Board. We have received formal complaints regarding your appointment to this position." Grace's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "What sort of complaints, Mr. Pemberton?" "Questions about your physical capability to fulfill the duties of a frontier schoolteacher," Pemberton replied, his tone professionally neutral, but his implications clear. "Specifically, concerns about your ability to maintain discipline, supervise children during outdoor activities, and respond to emergency situations." The familiar sting of judgment based on her disability flooded through Grace, but this time it was compounded by the presence of her students and the realization that her career was under attack. She could see the confusion and worry on the children's faces, and her protective instincts flared. "Mr. Pemberton, I have been teaching here for 3 weeks. Perhaps you should evaluate my performance based on actual evidence rather than assumptions about my limitations." Hartford's smile was cold and satisfied. "The concerns go beyond mere physical capability, Miss Mitchell. There are also questions about your moral fitness for such a responsible position." Before Grace could ask what he meant, Hartford continued, "Your association with Daniel Cooper, for instance. A single woman living alone, spending considerable time in the company of an unmarried man. Surely you can understand how this raises questions about your judgment and propriety." The accusation hit Grace like a physical blow. Around the room, she could see her older students processing this adult conversation with growing alarm and confusion. Lucy Bradley's face was flushed with indignation, while Marcus Thompson looked ready to leap to his teacher's defense. "My association with Mr. Cooper has been completely appropriate," Grace said firmly, drawing on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed. "He has been a friend and mentor, helping me adjust to life in Cedar Falls. Any suggestion otherwise is both unfounded and insulting." The third man, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Miss Mitchell, I am Herbert Caldwell, representing the territorial government's investigation into irregularities in teacher appointments. We have documentation suggesting that your hiring was pushed through by certain influential community members without proper consideration of alternative candidates." Grace realized with growing horror that this was a coordinated attack, planned and executed with military precision. Hartford hadn't simply been spreading gossip about her. He had been building a formal case to have her removed from her position. "The school board followed proper procedures," she said, though she could hear the defensive note creeping into her voice. "My qualifications were thoroughly reviewed, and the decision was unanimous. A decision that may have been unduly influenced by personal relationships rather than professional merit," Caldwell replied, glancing meaningfully toward the door. As if summoned by his look, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. Behind him, Grace could see Robert Morrison, Margaret Sullivan, and several other community members gathering, drawn by word that something was happening at the schoolhouse. "What's going on here?" Daniel demanded, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that made everyone in the room take notice. Hartford's satisfaction was evident as he turned to face Daniel. "We were just discussing Miss Mitchell's suitability for her position, Cooper. Though I suppose your presence here proves our point about inappropriate associations." Daniel's scarred face darkened with fury, but before he could respond, a clear young voice cut through the tension. "That's not true." Everyone turned to see Lucy Bradley standing beside her desk, her small face blazing with righteous indignation. Miss Mitchell is the best teacher we've ever had, and Mr. Cooper helps everybody in town. You're telling lies." Marcus Thompson rose to his feet as well. "Lucy's right. Miss Mitchell taught me more mathematics in 3 weeks than I learned in 2 years before she came, and she never treats anyone different because of how they look or talk or walk." One by one, other students began standing up, their young voices joining in defense of their teacher. Even 6-year-old Emma Caldwell, who barely understood what was happening, stood up because her classmates were doing it. "Miss Mitchell reads us stories and explains things so we understand," called out Peter Bradley. "She helped my mama with her reading when she came to visit," added Sarah Whitman. "She knows more about everything than anybody," declared 10-year-old James Morrison. The spontaneous defense by her students was more moving than anything Grace had ever experienced. These children, who had known her for only 3 weeks, were willing to stand up to intimidating adults on her behalf. The trust and loyalty they were showing made her throat tight with emotion. Robert Morrison pushed his way into the schoolhouse, his face flushed with anger. What is the meaning of this disruption? These children should be learning, not listening to adult disputes. Pemberton turned to address Morrison directly. "Mr. Morrison, as head of the school board, you should be aware that formal complaints have been filed regarding Miss Mitchell's appointment. The territorial authorities require that these concerns be addressed." "What concerns?" Morrison demanded. "Miss Mitchell has exceeded every expectation we had for this position. Concerns about her physical limitations, her moral conduct, and the irregularities in her hiring process," Hartford said smoothly, clearly enjoying the chaos he had created. Margaret Sullivan stepped forward, her lined face stern with disapproval. "James Hartford, you should be ashamed of yourself conducting this kind of persecution in front of children. I'm simply ensuring that our community's educational standards are maintained," Hartford replied sanctimoniously. Daniel moved closer to Grace, his presence both protective and supportive. "If you have issues with the school board's decisions, Hartford, you should address them through proper channels, not by staging public ambushes." "The proper channels have been followed," Caldwell interjected, opening his portfolio to reveal a sheaf of official-looking documents. "These complaints have been filed with the Territorial Education Authority, and they require immediate investigation." Grace realized that this confrontation was not accidental or spontaneous. Hartford had been planning this attack for weeks, gathering allies and building a bureaucratic case designed to overwhelm her supporters with official procedure and formal accusations. "Very well," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the heated exchanges around her. "If my position is under official investigation, then I suppose we should follow proper procedures." She turned to address her students, who were still standing in silent solidarity beside their desks. "Children, please sit down. I need to discuss this situation with these gentlemen privately." "We don't want you to go, Miss Mitchell," Lucy Bradley said, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "No one has said anything about anyone going anywhere," Grace replied gently, though her heart was breaking at the distress on her students' faces. "Right now, I need you all to be brave and remember everything we've learned about facing difficult situations with courage and dignity." She turned back to Hartford and his companions, drawing herself up to her full height despite her need for the walking stick. "Gentlemen, if you wish to discuss these concerns, we can do so, but not in front of the children, and not without proper representation from the school board and community members who have the authority to make decisions about my employment." Pemberton nodded reluctantly. "That seems reasonable. Shall we reconvene?" "At the town hall this evening. 7 o'clock, Morrison said firmly, "and I want every member of the school board present, along with any parents who wish to attend." As the group prepared to leave, Daniel moved to Grace's side, his voice low but audible to everyone in the room. "Grace, you know you have the support of everyone who matters in this community. Hartford's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction at this public display of concern. How touching, Cooper. I'm sure the territorial authorities will find your devotion to Miss Mitchell's cause quite illuminating. The implication was clear, and Grace saw Daniel's hands clench into fists. Before he could respond, she placed her hand gently on his arm. "Thank you, Daniel," she said clearly, making no attempt to hide their mutual regard. "Your friendship has meant everything to me during my time in Cedar Falls." Her calm acknowledgement of their relationship, without apology or defensive explanation, seemed to take some of the wind out of Hartford's sails. He had expected denial or embarrassment, not dignified honesty. As the visitors finally left, Grace found herself surrounded by her students, all of them wanting to offer comfort and reassurance. Their loyalty and love were overwhelming, but she knew that the real battle was yet to come. That evening's meeting would determine not just her future in Cedar Falls, but whether a community would stand by someone they had chosen to trust, or whether fear and prejudice would triumph over fairness and compassion. Looking around at the faces of her students, Grace felt a fierce determination rising within her. These children deserved better than to see their teacher destroyed by petty vindictiveness and bureaucratic manipulation. Whatever the cost, she would fight to remain in the position where she could serve them and this community that had become her home. The confrontation with Hartford was far from over, but Grace Mitchell had found something worth fighting for, and she would not surrender without giving everything she had to the battle ahead. The Cedar Falls Town Hall had never held so many people in its brief existence. By 6:30, every chair was filled, and additional townspeople lined the walls and spilled out onto the front steps. Word of the afternoon's confrontation at the schoolhouse had spread through the community like wildfire, and it seemed as though nearly every adult in town had come to witness what many were calling the most important meeting in Cedar Falls history. Grace sat in the front row, flanked by Robert Morrison and Margaret Sullivan, trying to project calm confidence despite the churning anxiety in her stomach. She wore her best dress, a deep burgundy wool that complemented her auburn hair, and had arranged her appearance with the same care she might have taken for a formal examination. Her walking stick rested against her chair, visible to all but, no longer a source of shame or self-consciousness. Daniel occupied a seat directly behind her, close enough that she could sense his supportive presence without turning around. Throughout the day, he had been a steady source of strength, helping her prepare for this evening's proceedings while maintaining his own composure in the face of Hartford's increasingly bold accusations. The territorial representatives sat at a table facing the assembled crowd. Charles Pemberton maintained his professional neutrality, shuffling through documents with bureaucratic efficiency. Herbert Caldwell appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the size and mood of the gathering, clearly having expected a small, manageable hearing rather than this community-wide demonstration. James Hartford, however, seemed to be enjoying the attention, confident that his carefully orchestrated campaign would achieve its intended result. Mayor William Barnes called the meeting to order with obvious reluctance. A mild-mannered man who preferred consensus to conflict, Barnes had been thrust into the middle of a controversy that threatened to divide the community he had worked so hard to unite. "Ladies and gentlemen," Barnes began, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, "we're here tonight to address concerns that have been raised regarding our school teacher, Miss Grace Mitchell. Mr. Pemberton, representing the Territorial Education Board, will present the formal complaints." Pemberton rose, consulting his notes with practiced efficiency. "Thank you, Mayor Barnes. The territorial authorities have received 3 specific complaints regarding Miss Mitchell's appointment and performance as Cedar Falls schoolteacher." He paused, allowing the gravity of official procedure to settle over the room. "First, questions have been raised about her physical capability to fulfill all duties required of a frontier educator, including supervision of outdoor activities, response to emergency situations, and maintenance of classroom discipline. Grace felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her expression steady as disapproving murmurs rippled through the audience. Second, Pemberton continued, concerns have been expressed about irregularities in the hiring process, suggesting that personal influence rather than merit may have determined the outcome of her appointment. The murmurs grew louder and distinctly hostile. Grace could see faces in the crowd reflecting anger at the implication that their school board had acted improperly. Third and finally, Pemberton's voice grew more pointed, questions of moral conduct have been raised regarding Miss Mitchell's personal associations and their potential impact on her effectiveness as a moral exemplar for impressionable young minds. The room erupted. Shouts of shame and disgraceful filled the air, though it was unclear whether the crowd was directing their anger at the accusations or at those making them. Mayor Barnes gavelled for order repeatedly before the noise subsided. Enough for him to be heard. Mr. Pemberton, these are serious charges, Barnes said formally. What evidence supports these claims? Before Pemberton could respond, James Hartford rose from his seat, clearly prepared for this moment. Mayor Barnes, if I may address the concerns I've raised with the territorial authorities. Barnes nodded reluctantly, and Hartford moved to the front of the room with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. Fellow citizens, Hartford began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to public speaking, I take no pleasure in bringing these concerns forward, but we cannot allow sentiment to override our responsibility to our children's welfare. He gestured toward Grace with calculated sympathy. Miss Mitchell is undoubtedly a well-meaning woman, but frontier life demands more than good intentions. How can she supervise children at play when she cannot run after them? How can she maintain order among rowdy boys when she cannot physically enforce discipline? How can she respond to emergencies when her own mobility is so severely limited? Grace felt each question like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain silent, knowing that this was Hartford's moment to present his case. Moreover, Hartford continued, warming to his theme, the hiring process was clearly influenced by personal relationships rather than objective evaluation. Daniel Cooper's advocacy for Miss Mitchell was well known throughout the proceedings, and his continued involvement in her affairs raises serious questions about the propriety of their association. He turned to face Grace directly, his expression a mask of regretful concern. A school teacher must be above reproach, a moral beacon for our community. Can we honestly say that Miss Mitchell's conduct meets this standard? The silence that followed. Hartford's speech was heavy with tension. Grace could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, waiting to see how she would respond to this carefully constructed attack on her character and capability. Mayor Barnes cleared his throat. Miss Mitchell, you have the right to respond to these allegations. Grace rose slowly, using her walking stick for support, but not leaning heavily upon it. She had spent the afternoon preparing for this moment, knowing that her future in Cedar, Bolts, and perhaps her entire future, depended on what she said in the next few minutes. Thank you, Mayor Barnes, she began, her voice clear and strong despite her nervousness. Mr. Hartford has raised 3 concerns, and I will address each one directly. She turned to face the assembled crowd, making eye contact with familiar faces scattered throughout the room. Regarding my physical capabilities, I acknowledge that I cannot run, climb, or engage in many activities that others take for granted. What I can do is teach mathematics to Marcus Thompson at a level that challenges his brilliant mind. I can help Sarah Whitman's mother learn to read the letters from her sister back in Ohio. I can organize lessons that engage every child in my classroom, from 6-year-old Emma to 16-year-old Marcus. Her voice grew stronger as she found her rhythm. In 3 weeks of teaching, I have not had a single discipline problem that required physical intervention. My students respect me, not because they fear me, but because I respect them as individuals, with minds worth nurturing and dreams worth encouraging. Scattered applause began in the back of the room, building as Grace continued. As for emergency response, I have already demonstrated my capabilities. When little Tommy Morrison fell and cut his forehead during recess last week, I provided appropriate first aid while sending Marcus to fetch Dr. Hartwell. The child was treated promptly and properly, with no adverse effects from my supposed limitations. The applause grew louder, and Grace could see nodding heads throughout the audience. Regarding the hiring process, she continued, her tone becoming more forceful, I was evaluated by the entire school board based on my educational credentials, my teaching philosophy, and my interviews with parents and children. Yes, Daniel Cooper introduced me to the community, just as any citizen might introduce a qualified candidate to those making hiring decisions. To suggest that this constitutes improper influence is to insult the integrity of every school board member who voted unanimously to offer me this position. Robert Morrison stood up from his seat. Mayor Barnes, I'd like to address that specific point. Barnes nodded, and Morrison faced the crowd with the righteous anger of a man whose honor had been questioned. James Hartford's implication that this school board can be bought or unduly influenced is an insult I will not tolerate, Morrison declared. We spent weeks evaluating Miss Mitchell's qualifications. We interviewed her extensively, observed her interactions with children, and reviewed letters of recommendation from her previous positions. Our decision was based solely on merit, and I resent any suggestion otherwise. Margaret Sullivan rose. As well, I second Mr. Morrison's statement. Miss Mitchell was the most qualified candidate we had seen in 2 years of searching for a proper teacher. Grace felt a surge of gratitude for their public support, but she knew she still had to address Hartford's most damaging accusation. Finally, she said, turning to look directly at Hartford, regarding questions of moral conduct and my association with Daniel Cooper. The room fell silent again, everyone aware that this was the most sensitive aspect of the evening's proceedings. Mr. Cooper has been my friend, my mentor, and my guide to life in Cedar Falls, Grace said clearly. He has shown me kindness when I was a stranger, supported my professional aspirations, and treated me with respect and dignity at all times. Our friendship has been conducted openly, in full view of this community, with no attempt at secrecy or deception. She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. If Mr. Hartford believes that a single woman cannot maintain friendships with honorable men without compromising her moral fitness, then he has a very narrow understanding of both friendship and morality. I will not apologize for accepting the kindness of good people, nor will I pretend that Daniel Cooper's support has been anything other than the decent behavior of a man who understands what it means to be judged unfairly. The applause that erupted at these words was immediate and thunderous. Grace could see tears in the eyes of several women in the audience, and the men were nodding approval with visible satisfaction. Daniel rose from his seat, and the room gradually quieted as people realized he intended to speak. Mayor Barnes, Daniel said, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall, I'd like to address Mr. Hartford's characterization of my relationship with Miss Mitchell. Barnes nodded, and Daniel moved to stand beside Grace, his scarred face set with determination. James Hartford seems to believe that friendship between unmarried adults is inherently scandalous, Daniel began. Perhaps that says more about his own character than about ours. Laughter rippled through the audience, and Hartford's face darkened with anger. Miss Mitchell came to Cedar Falls as a stranger in difficult circumstances, Daniel continued. I offered her the same courtesy I would extend to any newcomer to our community: assistance in finding her footing, introductions to people who might help her, and friendship during a challenging transition. His voice grew warmer as he looked at Grace. What I discovered was a woman of remarkable courage, intelligence, and character. Someone who had traveled across a continent to start a new life, who faced rejection and disappointment with dignity, and who had the strength to rebuild her dreams when her original plans fell apart. He turned back to face the crowd. If supporting such a person makes me guilty of improper conduct, then I proudly accept that guilt. This community is stronger because Grace Mitchell chose to make it her home. The applause was deafening now, and Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks at Daniel's public declaration of his feelings for her. When the noise finally subsided, Mayor Barnes looked toward the territorial representatives. "Mr. Pemberton, Mr. Caldwell, you've heard the responses to your concerns. What is your assessment?" Pemberton consulted with Caldwell in whispered conversation before responding. "Mayor Barnes, based on tonight's testimony and our observations of community sentiment, it appears that Miss Mitchell enjoys strong local support for her position." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the evening had taken. However, the formal complaints must still be investigated according to territorial procedures. Before he could continue, a new voice spoke from the back of the room. "Perhaps I can help clarify the situation." Everyone turned to see Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, making her way through the crowd, carrying a leather portfolio similar to the one Caldwell had brought. "Dr. Hartwell," Mayor Barnes said with obvious relief, "please come forward." Elizabeth moved to the front of the room with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. "Gentlemen, I represent the Territorial Women's Education Association, and we have been monitoring the situation in Cedar Falls with great interest." She opened her portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. "Miss Mitchell's qualifications and performance have been evaluated by our organization, and we find them to be exemplary. Her innovative teaching methods, her success with students of varying abilities, and her positive impact on this community make her exactly the kind of educator we hope to see in frontier schools." Pemberton looked distinctly uncomfortable as Elizabeth continued. "Furthermore, our investigation into the complaints filed against Miss Mitchell reveals that they originated from a single source, Mr. James Hartford, who has a documented history of personal conflicts with the defendant. The territorial authorities should be aware that these complaints appear to be motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate educational concerns." Hartford's face had gone white with anger and what appeared to be fear. "That's preposterous. I was acting in the community's best interests." Elizabeth fixed him with a withering stare. "Mr. Hartford's definition of the community's best interests seems to coincide remarkably with his own preferences and prejudices." She turned back to address Pemberton directly. "The Women's Education Association formally recommends that Miss Mitchell be commended for her service to Cedar Falls and that the complaints against her be dismissed as unfounded." Pemberton shuffled his papers nervously, clearly recognizing that the evening had not gone as Hartford had planned. "Dr. Hartwell, your organization's support is noted. However—" "Mr. Pemberton," interrupted Tom Bradley, rising from his seat. "In the middle of the room, I'd like to say something as a parent." Without waiting for permission, Bradley continued, "My children have learned more in 3 weeks with Miss Mitchell than they did in the previous year. Lucy comes home excited about her lessons, and the twins are actually eager to do their arithmetic. That's not something you can measure with forms and regulations, but it's what matters to those of us entrusting our children to her care." "Here, here," called out several other parents, and soon the room was filled with testimonials about Grace's impact on their children's education and enthusiasm for learning. As the voices of support continued, Grace noticed that James Hartford was looking increasingly isolated and desperate. His carefully orchestrated campaign was crumbling in the face of genuine community solidarity. Finally, Mayor Barnes called for order once more. "Mr. Pemberton, I believe you've heard enough testimony to make your recommendation to the territorial authorities." Pemberton looked at his companion, then at the hostile faces surrounding him, and finally at the stack of supportive documentation Elizabeth Hartwell had presented. "Based on tonight's proceedings," he said reluctantly, "it appears that the complaints against Miss Mitchell lack sufficient merit to warrant further territorial intervention. The local community has clearly expressed its satisfaction with her performance, and there is no evidence of the alleged irregularities in her appointment." The cheer that erupted from the crowd was so loud it could probably be heard throughout Cedar Falls. Grace felt her knees weaken with relief, and Daniel's hand found hers, squeezing gently in shared triumph. As the celebration continued around them, Grace caught sight of James Hartford making his way toward the exit, his face a mask of frustrated rage. Their eyes met for a moment across the crowded room, and she saw in his expression the knowledge that his campaign against her had not only failed, but had damaged his own standing in the community. "Grace," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ongoing celebration, "there's something I need to ask you." She turned to look at him, seeing in his scarred face an expression of hope and determination that made her heart race. "Not here," she said softly, understanding that whatever he wanted to say deserved privacy and proper attention. Daniel nodded, his eyes warm with understanding and promise. "Soon," he agreed. As the meeting finally began to break up, Grace found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, all eager to congratulate her on her victory and express their confidence in her continued service to their children. But even as she accepted their kind words and warm embraces, her attention kept drifting to Daniel, who remained nearby, waiting patiently for the crowds to thin so they could have the conversation that would determine not just her professional future in Cedar Falls, but the shape of the personal happiness she had never dared to hope she might find. The battle for her position was won, but Grace sensed that the most important conversation of her life was still ahead of her. Spring arrived in Cedar Falls with an explosion of wildflowers that painted the mountain meadows in brilliant shades of purple, yellow, and white. Grace stood at the window of her teacherage, watching her students chase butterflies during their afternoon recess, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed in the 8 months since that devastating morning at the train station. The schoolhouse had become the beating heart of Cedar Falls' educational community. What had begun as a simple one-room school had evolved into something far more ambitious under Grace's guidance. Evening classes for adults who had never learned to read brought farmers and their wives together over McGuffey readers and arithmetic primers. Saturday morning sessions for advanced students like Marcus Thompson had expanded into an informal academy that was drawing attention from educators as far away as Denver. The territorial education authorities, chastened by their experience with James Hartford's false accusations, had not only vindicated Grace completely, but had begun holding her program up as a model for other frontier communities. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had become not just an ally, but a close friend, visiting Cedar Falls monthly to observe Grace's teaching methods and help implement similar programs elsewhere in the territory. Grace's personal life had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. The conversation with Daniel that had been promised on the night of the town hall meeting had taken place 3 days later, during a walk along the creek that gave the town its name. She still remembered every word of that evening, every expression that had crossed his scarred face as they finally spoke openly about the feelings that had been growing between them. "Grace," he had said as they paused beside a grove of aspen trees whose leaves were just beginning to show their autumn gold, "I need you to know that what I feel for you goes far beyond friendship or even admiration." Her heart had thundered in her chest as she waited for him to continue. "I love you," he had said simply, his dark eyes steady on hers. "I love your courage, your intelligence, your kindness to everyone you meet. I love the way you see possibilities where others see only limitations. I love the strength that carried you across a continent to start over, and the grace with which you've built a new life here." She had felt tears gathering in her eyes as he spoke, not from sadness, but from overwhelming joy at hearing her own feelings reflected in his words. "I love you too, Daniel," she had whispered, and the smile that had transformed his face at those words was something she would treasure for the rest of her life. Their courtship had been conducted with the same open honesty that had characterized their friendship. They took walks together through the town and surrounding countryside, attended church services side by side, and participated jointly in community events. There was no attempt to hide their growing attachment, no apologetic explanations for their mutual affection. The community had embraced their relationship with the same warmth they had shown for Grace's teaching. Mrs. Patterson at the hotel had taken to preparing special meals when Daniel joined Grace for dinner. Sarah Morrison had begun dropping hints about wedding plans. Even the children in Grace's classes had started making not-so-subtle comments about when their teacher might become Mrs. Cooper. James Hartford had left Cedar Falls shortly after the disastrous town hall meeting, selling his ranch to a cattle syndicate from Denver and departing without ceremony or farewell. His departure had been met with a collective sigh of relief from the community, and his absence had eliminated the last source of organized opposition to Grace's presence in town. Now, on this perfect May afternoon, Grace was preparing for the most important day of her new life. Tomorrow was her wedding day, and the entire town was buzzing with preparations for what promised to be the social event of the year. A knock at the teacherage door interrupted her reverie. She opened it to find Elizabeth Hartwell and Margaret Sullivan, both carrying packages wrapped in brown paper and wearing expressions of barely contained excitement. "Grace, dear," Elizabeth said, bustling into the small sitting room, "we've brought the final fittings for your dress, and Margaret has news about the reception arrangements." Margaret set down her package and beamed at Grace. "The ladies of the church have outdone themselves. We'll have tables set up in the town square with enough food to feed everyone in Cedar Falls twice over. Mrs. Patterson is contributing her famous apple pies, and even the men are getting involved. Daniel's forge will be decorated with flowers, and Tom Bradley is organizing music for dancing." Grace felt overwhelmed by the generosity and enthusiasm of her adopted community. "You've all done so much work. I hardly know how to thank you." "Nonsense," Elizabeth said briskly, beginning to unwrap her package. "You've given this town its first real school, inspired a generation of children to love learning, and brought out the best in one of our most valued citizens. A wedding celebration is the least we can do." The dress that emerged from Elizabeth's package took Grace's breath away. Made from ivory silk that had been shipped from San Francisco specifically for the occasion, it featured intricate beadwork along the bodice and sleeves that caught the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. The design was elegant but practical, with a higher neckline and longer sleeves that would allow Grace to move comfortably while still creating a sense of bridal formality. "Elizabeth, it's beautiful," Grace said, running her fingers over the delicate fabric. "But surely this must have cost a fortune." "It's a gift from the Women's Education Association," Elizabeth replied with satisfaction. Consider it an investment in frontier education. You've become something of a celebrity in territorial education circles, you know. Your methods are being studied and implemented throughout the Western Territories. Margaret opened her own package to reveal a wreath of silk flowers and ribbons that would serve as Grace's bridal headpiece. And this is from the ladies of Cedar Falls. We thought it would be perfect with your auburn hair. As Grace tried on the headpiece, Margaret and Elizabeth fussed over the arrangement of flowers and ribbons, their chatter filling the small room with warmth and feminine camaraderie. It was a kind of community acceptance that Grace had never experienced before, not tolerance or charity, but genuine inclusion and affection. "Have you seen Daniel today?" Elizabeth asked, as she made final adjustments to the flower arrangement. Grace shook her head, smiling. "He's been banished from my presence until tomorrow morning. Ben Cartwright and the other men have taken charge of keeping him occupied with bachelor festivities." "Probably just as well," Margaret observed with a laugh. "He's been so nervous the past week that he hammered his thumb twice yesterday, according to Ben." The thought of Daniel being nervous about their wedding was both touching and amusing to Grace. Their relationship had developed with such natural ease that she sometimes forgot how significant this step was for both of them. Daniel had never married, had convinced himself after his accident that he would spend his life alone. For him to open his heart to love and partnership required courage that matched her own decision to start over in a new place. As the afternoon wore on, a steady stream of visitors arrived at the teacherage. Students came to wish their teacher well and to present handmade gifts. A sampler embroidered by Lucy Bradley, a wooden box crafted by Marcus Thompson, wildflower bouquets gathered by the younger children. Parents stopped by to express their gratitude for Grace's impact on their families and to contribute food or decorations for tomorrow's celebration. Dr. Peterson arrived with his wife to deliver a wedding gift from the medical community, a complete set of first aid supplies for the school, along with a comprehensive medical handbook. "Frontier teachers often serve as emergency medical responders," he explained. "These supplies will help you handle minor injuries and ailments until professional help can arrive." Even the town's business community had organized contributions. Robert Morrison presented Grace with a beautiful leather-bound ledger for school records, while the bank contributed funds for additional textbooks and educational materials. As evening approached, Grace found herself alone again, surrounded by gifts and well-wishes, but needing time to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Daniel Cooper, wife to a man who saw her scars as evidence of courage rather than failure, partner to someone who valued her mind and spirit above all else. The transformation from rejected mail-order bride to respected educator and beloved community member felt almost dreamlike in its completeness. 8 months ago, she had sat on the train platform with $12 to her name and no prospects beyond returning to a life of dependence and pity. Now she had a career she loved, a community that valued her contributions, and a future filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. A soft knock interrupted her reflection. Grace opened the door to find Daniel standing on her threshold, hat in hand and looking slightly sheepish. "I know I'm supposed to stay away until tomorrow," he said, his scarred face creasing into the smile that never failed to make her heart skip. "But I had something I wanted to give you privately." Grace stepped aside to let him enter, noting the small wrapped package in his hand. "The ladies would scandalize us both if they knew you were here." "Let them scandalize," Daniel replied with a chuckle. "I've waited long enough to give you this." He handed her the package, which was surprisingly heavy for its size. Grace unwrapped it carefully to reveal a music box made from polished wood, its surface inlaid with intricate patterns of different wood types. When she lifted the lid, a gentle melody began to play, beautiful dreamer, while a tiny figure of a dancing couple turned slowly in the center. "Daniel, did you make this?" He nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. "It took me 3 months to get the mechanism right. Ben helped with some of the finer woodwork, but the design is mine." Grace wound the music box and watched the dancing figures turn, overwhelmed by the time and care that had gone into creating something so beautiful and personal. "It's the most wonderful gift I've ever received." "There's an inscription," Daniel said quietly. Grace looked more closely and found tiny letters carved along the inner edge of the lid. "For Grace, who taught me to dance again. D.C." Tears filled her eyes as she read the words. Daniel had told her about his love of dancing before his accident, how the burns on his right side had made him self-conscious about social activities he had once enjoyed. The metaphor of dancing again spoke to so much more than physical movement. It represented his willingness to embrace joy and partnership after years of isolation. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching up to touch the scarred side of his face. "With gentle fingers, for the music box and for everything else you've given me." Daniel covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his cheek. "You've given me far more than I could ever return. A year ago, I was resigned to spending my life alone, convinced that my scars made me unsuitable for love or partnership. You showed me that healing comes not from hiding our wounds, but from finding someone who sees them as part of our story rather than the end of it." They stood together in the fading light, holding each other close and marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. Tomorrow would begin their life together as husband and wife, but tonight was for reflection on how far they had both traveled from the broken people they had been when they first met. "I should go," Daniel said reluctantly, as full darkness settled over Cedar Falls. "Ben will send a search party if I'm gone much longer." Grace walked with him to the door, unwilling to end this quiet moment of connection before their lives changed forever. "Until tomorrow, Mrs. Cooper," Daniel said softly, using her married name for the first time. "Until tomorrow, my dear husband," Grace replied, and the joy that filled Daniel's eyes at those words was brighter than all the stars beginning to appear in the Montana sky. The morning of Grace's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every color more vivid and every sound more distinct. She woke before sunrise, too excited to sleep, and spent the early hours making final preparations and marveling at how perfectly everything had fallen into place. Elizabeth Hartwell arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, accompanied by Margaret Sullivan and Sarah Morrison, all of them bustling with nervous energy and determination to ensure that every detail of Grace's wedding day was perfect. "No breakfast," Elizabeth announced firmly as she began unpacking supplies for Grace's hair and makeup. "We can't risk any stains on that beautiful dress." "But I'm starving," Grace laughed, though she obediently allowed herself to be fussed over like a cherished doll. "Mrs. Patterson has prepared a special wedding brunch that will be served immediately after the ceremony," Margaret assured her. "You won't starve, dear." For the next 2 hours, Grace submitted to the ministrations of her self-appointed ladies' committee. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated the silk flower wreath with soft curls framing. Her face and longer strands twisted into an elegant chignon. Elizabeth applied subtle cosmetics that enhanced Grace's natural coloring without creating an artificial appearance. Finally came the dress itself, the ivory silk settling around Grace's form like a dream made tangible. The beadwork caught the morning light streaming through the teacherage windows, creating patterns that shifted and sparkled with every movement. "Oh, Grace," Sarah Morrison breathed, tears filling her eyes, "you look absolutely radiant." Grace stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the elegant woman who looked back at her. The transformation was more than cosmetic. She radiated a confidence and joy that had been unimaginable 8 months ago. "Ladies," came Robert Morrison's voice from outside the teacherage, "the groom is getting restless, and half the territory has gathered to see this wedding. Are we ready?" Elizabeth made one final adjustment to Grace's veil, then stepped back with satisfaction. "We are indeed ready." The short walk from the teacherage to the church became a processional as the entire population of Cedar Falls lined the streets to wish Grace well. Children threw flower petals in her path, while adults called out congratulations and blessings. Grace moved slowly, partly because of her walking stick, but mostly because she wanted to savor every moment of this incredible day. The church was packed beyond capacity, with additional chairs arranged in the aisles and overflow seating on the front steps. As the organist began the wedding march, a hush fell over the congregation, all heads turning to watch Grace's entrance. But Grace had eyes only for Daniel, who stood waiting at the altar in a black suit that had been tailored specifically for the occasion. His scarred face was radiant with joy and love, and the smile that spread across his features as he saw her walking toward him was worth every hardship she had endured to reach this moment. Robert Morrison, serving as both school board president and surrogate father, offered Grace his arm for the final steps down the aisle. "Ready to become Mrs. Cooper," he whispered. "I've been ready since the day I met him," Grace whispered back. Reverend Williams, who had arrived in Cedar Falls only 2 months ago but had quickly become beloved by the congregation, began the ceremony with words that seemed written specifically for Grace and Daniel's situation. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of 2 souls who have found in each other not just love but healing. Grace and Daniel come to this altar not as perfect beings, but as people who have been tested by life's trials and have emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of true partnership." The familiar words of the marriage ceremony took on special meaning as Grace and Daniel spoke them to each other. When Daniel slipped the simple gold band he had crafted himself onto Grace's finger, his voice was steady and sure. "With this ring, I thee wed, and pledge to honor and cherish you for all the days of our lives." Grace's response came from the depths of her heart. "With this ring, I thee wed, and promise to stand beside you in joy and sorrow, in strength and weakness, for as long as we both shall live." When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that erupted from the congregation was so loud it probably echoed throughout the entire mountain valley. Daniel lifted Grace's veil with hands that trembled slightly with emotion, and their first kiss as married couple was witnessed not just by their immediate community, but by representatives from territorial government, educational associations, and neighboring towns who had come to honor the woman who had become a symbol of frontier determination and success. The reception that followed was a celebration unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever seen. Tables laden with food stretched across the town square, while musicians provided entertainment that had couples dancing well into the afternoon. Grace and Daniel moved through the festivities like royalty, receiving congratulations and gifts from friends and strangers alike. Marcus Thompson, now 17, and preparing to leave for college in Denver with a scholarship Grace had helped him obtain, presented the newlyweds with a hand-drawn map showing all the places they had walked together during their courtship. "So you'll always remember how your love story began," he explained with teenage solemnity. Lucy Bradley, now 11 and Grace's most devoted student, contributed a poem she had written about courage and kindness that brought tears to many eyes. Even little Emma Caldwell, who had been only 6 when Grace first arrived, sang a song she had composed about her teacher's wedding day. As the afternoon wore on, Grace found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She remembered the desperation she had felt sitting on the train platform, rejected and alone. She thought about the kindness of strangers who had become family, the students who had taught her as much as she had taught them, and the community that had embraced her, not despite her differences, but because of the unique contributions those differences allowed her to make. Most of all, she thought about Daniel, who now stood beside her as her husband, greeting their wedding guests with the quiet dignity that had first attracted her to him. He had seen in her not a damaged woman to be pitied, but a strong spirit to be celebrated. Their love had grown not from desperate need, but from mutual respect and genuine affection. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Daniel appeared at Grace's side with 2 cups of punch and a mischievous smile. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, offering her one of the cups, "would you do me the honor of a dance?" Grace looked around at the couples still swaying to the music in the town square, then back at her husband's expectant face. "I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Cooper." They moved together onto the makeshift dance floor, Grace's walking stick set aside as Daniel's strong arms supported her. They danced slowly, carefully, but with a joy that was visible to everyone watching. Around them, other couples joined in, some of Grace's former students with their sweethearts, parents celebrating their children's teachers' happiness, and community members marking the end of a perfect day. As they turned together under the Montana stars, Grace reflected on how completely her definition of dancing had changed. Once, she had thought dancing required perfect physical ability. Now she understood that true dancing was about harmony between 2 hearts, about finding rhythm in shared dreams and shared love. "Happy, Mrs. Cooper?" Daniel asked, his voice warm against her ear. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Grace replied, and knew that she meant every word. The music played on, the stars grew brighter, and in the small frontier town of Cedar Falls, Montana, 2 people who had been broken by life's hardships began their new life together, whole not because their scars had healed, but because they had found someone who saw those scars as beautiful evidence of survival, courage, and the amazing human capacity to begin again. In the months and years that followed, Grace and Daniel Cooper would become legendary figures in Cedar Falls and throughout the Montana Territory. Grace's innovative teaching methods would be adopted by schools across the American West, while Daniel's blacksmith shop would grow into a thriving metalworking business that employed 12 men and served customers throughout the region. But their greatest achievement would always be the love they built together, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that true beauty lies not in perfection, but in the courage to keep moving forward despite the scars life leaves behind. Years later, when former students would return to visit their beloved teacher, now gray-haired, and grandmother to half the children in Cedar Falls, they would always comment on the same thing: the way she and Daniel still looked at each other with the same wonder and gratitude they had shown on their wedding day, as if they could hardly believe their good fortune in finding each other in a world that had not always been kind to either of them. And Grace, now Mrs. Cooper, would smile and tell them what she had learned during that transformative year when she traveled west as a rejected mail-order bride and found instead a life beyond her wildest dreams, that sometimes the most beautiful destinations are the ones we never planned to reach, and the greatest love stories begin not with perfection, but with the courage to let someone see us exactly as we are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.